And the Forgotten Children season begins tonight at 9, a landmark documentary series and a pioneering new project to help parents adopt children who are harder to place. Find Me a Family, after a system in crisis dispatches lost in care.
Accused of betrayal, the British care system is under fire for failing the country's most vulnerable kids. From adoptions that never happen.
I would love to have been adopted when I was a child. It would have been a lot easier to move from 30-odd placements.
To failures in foster care.
There's no such thing as a nice foster family. There's absolutely no such thing. It doesn't exist to me. It's just a fairy tale.
Tonight on Dispatches, in the wake of the controversy over Baby P, what's going wrong in the British care system? And what can be done to help the 80,000 kids who risk being lost in care?
I've been in care since I was 4, so that's 15 years, and I've moved 46 times.
The worst thing about being in care would have to be the constant loneliness.
I wasn't allowed to use the same cutlery. I had my separate ones.
I don't know how they can call it the care system, really, because it's not as if that many people actually do care.
The voices of young people who've just emerged from Britain's care system. The state takes 30,000 kids every year into care to protect them, but a high proportion of them are shunted from one carer to another, and many of them end up in impoverished, troubled lives. Why do we offer these kids care and then fail some of them so badly?
Some children in care will defy the odds and go on to higher education, to fulfilling, achieving lives. Sadly, for the majority, that's not going to be the case.
Young people who've been in the care system are overrepresented in prisons, overrepresented in the people who need mental health services, and their own children are more likely to go into the care system too.
1 in 3 young people living rough on the streets comes from care, which is completely unacceptable. That is a shameful social failure.
You know what I'm gonna get? I'm taking a journey through the British care system to find out why the state makes such a poor parent. I'll be looking at the 3 stages of care, from adoption to the lottery of foster care and the so-called dumping grounds of residential homes. I'm starting here at my own son's nursery. It's really important for babies and small children to form a bond with a loving adult from birth. Experts on attachment theory believe it's the trust and security which develops from this bond that allows a child to develop emotionally. These happy children have been able to form that bond with their parents. But last year in England alone, 4,300 babies were taken into care. Around half will remain in care. From the earliest age, the system appears to work against their chances of forming a loving, stable relationship.
Social workers will try their best to reunite them back with their birth mum and dad. But we also know that many of those attempts fail, so that children will once again come into the care system and they'll have another foster care placement with a different carer than the person who looked after them previously.
It's this unhappy chain of events, just when a tiny child needs stability, that has led many people to ask whether we've got our priorities wrong. The crucial age for infants to form their attachments is from 6 to 18 months. Yet babies taken into care wait on average 2¼ years to be adopted. Which raises the question, why can't we adopt them earlier?
Thinking about it, I would have liked to have been in a family, I would have liked to have been adopted.
I would love to have been adopted when I was a child. It would have been a lot easier to move from 30-odd placements.
All the the research shows that adoption is very successful. Adopters are totally committed to the children. It's the stability and the commitment from the adopters that make the difference.
Mary adopted her daughter from care. To protect her child's identity, Mary's asked to remain anonymous.
Stayed with the foster carer, went back to birth mum, came back to the foster carer and then stayed there until we adopted her. So she was in care a long time.
It was nearly 3 years before the official attempts to reunite the child with her birth mother ended in failure. By then, the child was 3.5, and the ideal age for bonding with her new mother was well past. Mary says the process itself seems to have had a traumatic effect on the child.
We just found out from the foster carer that she was quite badly affected by the attempts to make this relationship work between her and her birth mum.
In what way can you tell me?
Her behaviour became quite extreme. She used to headbang and display quite challenging behaviour. The obstacles that she's overcome in these last 2 years that she's been with us are just amazing. She had very limited speech. Now she talks too much. She's absolutely great. I think that that's massively key, the fact that she's got a loving, stable, structured life.
The first assumption of the law, that it's best for children to be with their birth parents, often has disturbing consequences. The irony is that it condemns many babies to long periods drifting in care. Official statistics for England reveal that each year, around 4,300 babies under 1 year old come into care, but only around 120 are adopted as babies. An estimated 2,000 babies will remain in care for long periods without ever going home again. If there are so many babies entering the system of care, why are so many parents who want to adopt told that there aren't any babies for adoption?
The infants are there in the care system, but they're not available for adoption. Courts have to make the decision that adoption is in the best interests of the child, and that can take some time for all the evidence to be heard, for parents to be able to present their case.
And am I right in understanding that from your research, this period is critical, really, in terms of the decision, the long-term impact on kids?
It's far harder to find adoptive parents the older the child gets. So for every year that there's delay, the chances of being adopted reduce by 20%.
So why do most tiny children come into care in the first place? Sometimes they come from families who have abused or neglected children in the past. But increasingly, they're from drug or alcohol-addicted parents who cannot look after them properly. In Glasgow alone, 120 babies a year are born addicted to heroin or crack. Professor Neil McKegney is a leading expert on drug addiction. He believes that the babies of hardened addicts should be quickly adopted by a time-limited deadline within a maximum of 18 months.
It can take 15 years to come off an addiction, and of course a child's life is lost well short of that sort of time frame, which is why I'm suggesting that we should have time frames in the UK. In fact, some people would say even 18 months is too long, because we know that these children can be harmed within a matter of weeks, if not months.
But what you're talking about can seem so draconian. The act is so final, the act of adoption. What arguments are there that are so compelling to do that?
Well, because the children's lives are lost, and they made no choice here. They didn't choose their parents' drug habit or alcohol dependency, but their lives can be lost as a result of it.
I'm off to the southeast coast to meet Senior Fire Officer Dave Hadjikostas and his wife Evelyn. They've been fostering for 15 years for their local authority. They've looked after 41 children of all ages, and they've seen several of them wait years for adoption.
We have experience of a woman who was prostituting herself for heroin. She got pregnant by a man who had already fathered children with whom he has no contact. And then there is a huge debate about whether either of them are in a position to look after the child? Well, the answer on day one was no. That child within months should be with a permanent family.
Can we have some bread, Mummy?
The child is still drifting in the care system, nearly aged 3. We've just let that child down because that child came into this world incredibly vulnerable, incredibly needy, and from day one was going to be adopted.
In Britain, as we've seen, a child can wait several years before the rights of its birth parents are put aside and adoption can happen. But in America, they found a way to speed up the entire process. Since 1997, US law says that a child must have a plan for a permanent home within 1 year of coming into foster care. After 15 months, the state takes steps to terminate parental rights if the child cannot be returned home safely.
Be willing to sort of, with your mom's help, to sort of tell us one thing.
Dr. Dan Hughes is a leading US child psychologist.
She started with her dad, who was very abusive. The purpose of that legislation was to prevent foster care drift, where a child stays in foster care year after year after year. And when the knowledge was there that there are many, many adoptive parents willing to adopt these children, but the children are not free to be adopted. And there was no confidence that they would return to their biological parents.
Babies in care in Britain wait on average 2¼ years before they're adopted into a permanent home. Dan Hughes believes that's far too long.
We cannot pretend that it doesn't hurt the child when they're reunited unsuccessfully, nor when they have to wait for years. And if we accept the reality that the system is damaging these children, is actually emotionally abusive to these children, then that's a more fair balance between the parental rights and the needs of the child.
There are tentative steps in Britain towards reducing the delays in adoption. It's called concurrent planning. Before David and Lucy adopted their baby, they first fostered the child, while simultaneous efforts were made to reunite him with his birth mother. This meant that when the decision to allow adoption was made, there was no delay.
The idea is that the birth mother is given about 9 months to try and prove to the courts that she would be able to look after her child. During that time, we have the baby living with us, but we take the baby to contact with the birth mother so that she's able to bond with the baby whilst we're also bonding with the baby.
The foster couple hoping to adopt at the end of the process must be prepared to give up the baby if a judge decides it's in the best interests of the child to return to the birth parent. It must have been incredibly hard knowing that you wanted this child, you wanted to adopt him, but there was always a chance that he would go back to his birth mother.
Yes, it was hard, but at the same time, we knew that it was a possibility that he would go back. We were ready for that. And
I think that was the hardest thing for me, was that I did get to know his birth mum well, and I really liked her, and part of me really wanted her to sort herself out, and felt very upset at any point when she didn't seem to be doing that, because I felt that the baby should be with her. At the same time, from the very first day that our son had been placed with us, I'd fallen completely in love with him, and the longer he stayed with us, the more I was in love with him, and the thought of losing him and not having him as our child forever and ever would have broken my heart.
What would you say concurrent planning provides the child with that traditional adoption doesn't?
I think it is just that it means that the child will only have at most 2 attachments to make.
It seems to me that concurrent planning is far better for the child than the traditional adoption process. Yet, it's estimated that less than 10% of local authorities in the UK offer concurrent planning in adoption. While delay is built into the system, some babies miss the opportunity to be adopted altogether. Once a child reaches the age of 5, the chances of their being adopted reduce dramatically.
Our experience of adopters is they have in their mind what they want, and it has to be that. So if they have in their mind that I desperately want to adopt a child with fair hair under 6 months, then that's all they're going to settle for. Now, if a child has drifted in the care system, They may have once been a 3-month-old fair-haired child, but by the time the adoption comes around and all the legal arguments been settled, that child is 3.5, and has been in 2 or 3 different placements and has or starting to emerge with a range of behavioural needs. Well, you know, what we haven't got is a big queue of adopters saying, oh yes please, I'll have that child.
Care should be about giving traumatised children a loving and stable family. And if the Americans are right, this could mean worrying less about the rights of the birth parents. In part 2, what happens to the 80,000 or so children in care each year who haven't been adopted? As I was to discover, a stable, permanent and loving home is the last thing that many of them get.
I've got a suitcase. I can't just pass me from person to person. I have feelings.
I remember when I moved last time, I didn't have no suitcases. I just had plastic bags. I had to just carry things. It doesn't feel like, you know, like when you see other people move, they got boxes and you put it in a removal van. We've got bags and we're taking a cab to our house. Like,
one place, I came home from school one day and my bags were packed and I was going.
There's no such thing as a nice foster family. There's absolutely no such thing. It doesn't exist to me. It's just a fairy tale.
I've had a bad carer, but she wasn't necessarily hitting me or nothing like that. She just couldn't kind of connect to my needs.
I wasn't allowed to use a washing machine because I was not family.
I've had carers where I've got a separate fridge to them. Like, so you eat what's in your fridge, and there wasn't much in there, so it'd be like, can't I go in the bigger fridge and everyone else eats from there?
I wasn't allowed to use a bath, especially when you have woman problems.
Sometimes, you know, I didn't have money because, you know, she didn't give me my weekly allowance. So the longest I've gone with no food, I think, in the house is about 2 days.
I'm on a journey around the British care system to discover why vulnerable children are not getting the start they deserve. Once children in care reach 5, they're far less likely to be adopted. They'll join the vast majority of children in care who are looked after by foster carers. These children need stability, security, and a permanent home.
Far too many of them are moving from foster care into residential care, maybe back again. They may be being moved long distances, they may be changing schools, giving up their friends, no longer having contact with extended family. It can be absolutely devastating for them.
The foster care system is unstable, and the system itself encourages that.
2/3 of kids in care in the UK, 50,000 children, are fostered. Some fostered children do brilliantly, most do not. So what are the failings in the system? The Hadji Costas are experienced foster carers who've seen the problems firsthand.
The system just hasn't got the capacity to place a child in the right home at the right time, first time. Because quite often when a child comes into care, not very much is known about the child, so you will find things out that will make it obvious that the child isn't in the best place. Sometimes the child will do their very best to be disruptive because what they desperately want is to be back with their birth family, however awful that is.
It is a case of heads on beds, and when the departments are pressured to find placements for the children, and maybe they're not the right placements for that child at the time.
We're supposed to say to that child, no, we've taken you into care, you're okay now. From now on, things are going to be okay. And within 6 months, the whole thing's broken down. You're saying to the kid, you know, you're going to have to move on again.
Foster care is creaking under the strain. In a recent survey, 2 out of every 5 carers complained that they don't get proper information about the kids they're looking after. Even worse, a quarter said they got the wrong information. The fostering network says that we're short of 10,000 carers. As a consequence, kids get moved around a lot.
I know a young man who's 16, he's had more than 40 placements, and this isn't a child who presents any particular type of challenging behaviour or has some criminal behaviour or some substance misuse issues or comes from a particularly difficult family.
What do you think the children really need?
It would have to be stability. To let the child know that there's someone there who is not going to walk out on them, someone who's always going to protect them and look after them and just stick up for them, really.
I'm in Manchester to meet young people who've experienced fostering problems. They are part of the charity A National Voice, run by and for children in care.
So could each of you tell me how many times have you had placement moves? Start with you, Kevin.
Well, I've had roughly, off the top of my head, I can remember I've had around about 25 different placements within Blackburn and around Lancashire.
25. Colin?
I'd say about 15, all over the place. Coventry, Yorkshire, Manchester, since I was 14.
Right. Nicola?
About 30, and that's before I went
30?
Roughly.
And Kirsty?
I've had 12 placements since I was 13 all around Manchester.
Right.
Moving is very stressful for any adult, but for a child to move from home to home, just making new friends, going into a new school, having to start a new school again, have to make new friends, that is really stressful.
I mean, looking back, what kind of effects do you think that had on you growing up?
All the friends that I used to have in Manchester, I lost them when I went to Coventry. And then schooling, it was really, really hard to get into school. It was hard to stay in one place and then go to school and get all the qualifications I needed.
Fostering problems have a huge impact on children's educational futures. Only 13% of children in care gain good GCSE grades compared to the national average of 62%. 53% leave care with no qualifications, and they're 7 times more likely to be excluded permanently from school.
Children move schools every time they move placement generally. We know that about a quarter of children in the care system have a statement of special educational needs, and this means that many of them have learning difficulties. We know that with the moves and the instability comes less of a chance of getting good exam results.
Did you ever have any problems with, absconding from school because of this difficulty in sort of forming relations and constantly having to move around?
Yeah, I had quite a lot because I felt like when I was in school, I wasn't wanted there. I was supposed to be the bad one because obviously being within the care system. So I felt like when I was there, they didn't want me there. And when I wasn't there, they were moaning because I wasn't in school.
I didn't get to choose what GCSEs I was doing. And then I moved schools. And then I had also different GCSEs that we're doing. And in the end, I didn't get to do them.
At the moment, society is letting those children down. The care system isn't working because the outcomes for these children are very, very poor. But there is a huge will to change that from the government, from local government, from the body of foster carers, from charities like mine. Things are changing, but they need to change a lot faster if we're going to be sure that these children have the lives that they're entitled to.
When children have had to leave abusive or neglectful families, they may enter the care system already damaged and needing help. But when those children are bounced from one home to another, their needs may increase and their behaviour get worse.
I'm in Glasgow to meet Angela Brown. She has fostered for 9 years. She's looked after some very challenging children.
I've had to deal with indiscriminately urinating all over my house, smearing faeces, destroying furniture. One that springs to mind is a boy that I had was being looked after by a really close friend, and said, I wonder what it would be like to cut somebody's throat, to kill someone and to taste their blood. And he says, I could do that. I could cut Angela's throat when she was sleeping, put a pillow over her face and just take the knife from there to there and nobody would hear her screaming. When he subsequently moved on, we found there was a hole in the mattress and this knife was placed within the fibres and the layers of the mattress, and it was the tiniest of potato knives. And this kid was 8.
The quality of foster care varies widely throughout the country. Angela is one of a minority of foster carers who has specialist training and skills. She fosters for Barnardo's, an independent agency.
I've been on courses for therapeutic crisis intervention, which shows me a way to handle a child, to try and calm them down, to get the closeness with them that they need to bring them down out their tantrum, and then just let them know that everything's all right and they're not going to be harmed for throwing that tantrum.
3/4 of fostered children have carers recruited through local authorities. They often provide only basic training and generally pay less than the private sector. Nationally, there's also a desperate need for more people to come forward for fostering.
There are lots of fantastic foster carers out there, but there's a huge shortage. We need about 10,000 more foster carers. So this restricted pool of carers means that sometimes it's difficult to get the right sort of carers for a child. We also need to look at how we remunerate foster carers. They have an allowance, but not all of them are paid.
The best solution for many children is to be cared for by a relative, known as kinship care. Children fostered in this way are far less likely to have multiple placements or to get in trouble with the law. It's also one of the solutions children favour most.
They didn't really pursue the chance of me going to live with another family member. They didn't really try it. They were just on putting me in a home.
Some carers will give up on a child if the young person's going through a hard patch, like not going to school or bunking off of school or things like that. They'd say, okay, well, we can't deal with this anymore. And I think it is a lack of heart, because you wouldn't do that to your own children.
Kinship placements are better. It depends how you get on with your family. I was so happy to go to my aunt's. I was just relieved that I got away.
There's no doubt that many children in care would like to be cared for by a member of their extended family, and often that's an extremely good option for them, and it's one that we would like to see considered first.
Only 11% of kids in care are formally placed by social services with family or friends. Some local authorities put few kids in this type of care, others do better. But there are thousands more children being looked after full-time by family and friends on a voluntary basis. In Liverpool, Maria has been caring for her 2 grandchildren since they were babies. Her daughter Vivian found it hard to cope with them, and then tragedy struck.
In 2000, my daughter was killed in a car crash. From then on, I was just left to care for the children. I've had no help from social services whatsoever. It was just, me being their grandmother. They said, if you can't look after the children, who can? So I've just taken over full mother care role, and that was it.
My nan, she cooks and cleans and does everything for us. On Mother's Day, I got my nan a cart and made her a cup of tea when she got up. Do you, Nanny, happy Mother's Day from Keelan?
I wouldn't have been happy about them going into care, because children really need to be with their own families, and they can see their own roots, and they're with a loving family, and they know where they are.
Maria gave up her job to care for the children and relies on unemployment and child benefits. She gets a guardian's allowance of £26 a week for the 2 children. But if she were a foster carer or a formal kinship carer, she'd also receive a minimum of £250 a week.
You could do with her calculator for that, couldn't you? Yeah.
What does it mean that you can't have now that you used to? I mean, the things you've had to give up?
You know, I've had to give my car up. We haven't been on holiday for the last 7 or 8 years. That's something the kids are always asking, can we go on holiday, Nanny? I say, I'm sorry, we can't, because I can't afford to go.
Nearly half of them are dinosaurs.
If Maria's grandchildren were in care, they'd each be costing the local authority around £25,000 a year. At the moment, Maria's getting an extra income of just £1,300.
The only grandparents that get financial help are those where the children were actually placed there by Children's Services. Where family members have done it informally between themselves and sorted it out, there's no payment. It's been estimated that there's 300,000 children living with grandparents or relatives in England, but we have no idea. It may be many more.
Parliament said recently that finding more kinship carers was a priority if we hope to give more foster kids stability and equal chances in life. But can we persuade hard-pressed families to do this without helping out financially and providing proper support? For the 10,000 children who have no family carers and can't find a steady place in fostering, there is only the residential home. Mired in decades of controversy and painted in children's fiction as the dumping grounds, they still have a bad reputation.
The children's home that I was in gave me 24 hours notice. My local authority couldn't find me a placement within those 24 hours, so I was taken with 2 members of staff, and my placement for the next 2 or 3 days was a tent.
None of the homes that I've been in, or the foster homes, never allowed pets.
I came in late once and I'd missed dinner, and I said I'm hungry, and they said that we've thrown your dinner in the bin.
I think I would have liked to have a pet. It would have, you know, I wouldn't have felt so alone. You know, maybe there would have been a little bit, you know, more of me to save.
Your average day would consist of kids getting up, going to school, or not going to school, depending on their mood.
One residential placement I was in was really terrible, and the staff were really quite bad there.
You might not want to be there, yeah, but you just learn to deal with it.
And then another day would be the house getting smashed, first thing in the morning, windows going through.
Some of the staff, their attitude was quite negative, and they were quite, I don't think they should have been working with children or young people.
Children's home was the best place for me, the top solution, but I constantly felt abandoned.
I'm on a journey around the British care system, trying to find out why we're failing so many of the kids we're supposed to be looking after. When fostering doesn't work and there's little chance of adoption, 10,000 children end up in residential homes, around 13% of all kids in care. In the last few decades, the home has become synonymous with sexual scandal, violence and despair. Places like Bryn Estyn in North Wales.
Some of the most disturbing allegations emerged from behind the mock Tudor facade of this home in Wrexham, which is now closed. 7 men have already been convicted. 10 of the children involved are now dead. Most of them committed suicide, their lives so scarred by the abuse they suffered.
If you go about the history of childcare, in the mid-90s lots of children's homes were exposed for poor quality of care, children being at the mercy of professionals that should be caring for them that were misusing children.
Residential care is usually seen as a last resort. Ofsted says 1 in 12 homes is inadequate. More than a third of home staff have no qualifications at all in caring for children. In places like Denmark, most are trained to degree level.
I'm told for what? I need to get it out of my system. I'm going to go up there and do something stupid with Longview. Because we come out with like bullshit.
A children's home in Essex. Because fostering is usually the first choice for children in the UK, the ones who end up in children's homes tend to be the most challenging.
You shout the most pathetic things. No, I get it out of my system. That just makes sense. No. Okay. You're a liar. Well, I'm leaving. I'm going to...
8 children live in this Essex home, aged 11 to 16. Many who come here have already had a number of failed foster placements. Dave Easterbrook has been in charge for 6 years. He believes residential care is best for these kids.
There are some children whose needs are so great that to ask any individual or couple or substitute family to expect to manage those difficulties, I think is a very, very tall order.
And we're talking about what kind of experiences, what kind of...
I mean, substance misuse, self-harm, absconding, you know, where children are persistently running around at night and you feel for them, you feel for their safety. I've known children eat dinner plates, drink bleach, pull their hair out in clumps. The children that are the most extreme end, that have been so harmed.
Certainly, some of the kids here in Essex value their home as a place of stability, not as a dumping ground.
No, she's eating at the moment. She'll probably be finished in a couple of minutes. People just think you just get put there and dumped with no one care about you and no one wants you. But it's not like that at all. It's, you have people care about you here and it's just like another home.
Holly, not her real name, has been at this home for 3 months. She's 16 and has been in care since she was 10. Her mum died 2 years ago.
A rose is my birth flower, and it was for my mock exam. I'd done it about my mum because she's passed away, so I've done it about her, just something to remember her by.
Despite everything, Holly is expected to get 9 GCSEs.
I'd like to go to college and do performing arts, and then hopefully go on to university.
Contrary to popular belief, some children actually prefer residential care.
Residential care has changed enormously in the last 10 years. The public think of sort of big orphanages, of dumping grounds. That's not the case anymore. Children's homes have on average 5 or 6 children, sometimes less. The workforce within children's homes are now being trained up, and there's some very, very good and exciting and innovative work going on in residential childcare.
20 miles away, in another part of Essex, I'm on my way to a children's home which is training staff in a new model for care imported from Europe, where residential care is the norm and not the exception. In Germany, 2/3 of care kids live in homes. In the UK, it's just 13%. Their system is different too. It's called social pedagogy. It means treating children in care as individuals and offering them more warmth, the same way a good parent might. Dave's wife, Susan Easterbrook, is in charge.
Can I come in?
I think the big thing is that we're now not frightened to take some risks.
Oh yeah, you're right.
With sort of child protection concerns and a worry about looking after children and making sure they're okay. We've not given enough thought to the actual benefits of taking some risks. And we're doing the things that young people should expect in their homes, and we shouldn't be any different.
It can be something as simple as allowing children in residential care to have a pet.
Come here. I've had this hamster since September last year, and I think she was about 8 weeks when I brought her, and her name's Donut. I really wanted one when I was in foster care, but they wouldn't let me have one.
Having pets before was something that we didn't do, really, because we were always concerned about what would happen if it died and the child became distressed, or if we had a child come into the children's home that was unkind to animals. So now what we'll do is have a look at the benefits and really be clear about what they are, rather than worry about the what-ifs.
I've only ever lost her once. Hopefully not again.
The idea that taking risks can be a positive thing is being extended to the way staff build personal relationships with the children. In the wake of abuse scandals, care workers have usually been advised to keep their distance.
I think it allows us to have a more personal attachment to the young people.
Yeah.
Previously, we had to be very careful even how we actually touched a young person.
It was a huge risk. I mean, any idea
yeah.
of relationship or contact.
Absolutely, and we were trained we couldn't hug young people. We were discouraged from hugging young people, which understandably, and we were taught how to do these side-on hugs, where you'd hug a young person on the shoulder and a side-on hug. Now, of course, with social pedagogy, that's been totally dispelled with it. Now we're encouraged to actually, as you would your own children, touch them and hug them, and get that personal interaction with them that previously we didn't have. And I think young people know.
The failure of the system to create stable childhoods has been criticised by a recent parliamentary report, which said that outcomes for looked after children still lag unacceptably far behind those for other children.
What do you think makes for a bad sort of residential care home, and what do you think makes for a good one?
Well, a good one, I mean, you can get ones that the people in there, they actually care about your feelings, and they mostly care about what you're doing and stuff. If you're hurting yourself and blah, 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 and stuff like that. Bad care homes where no one really gives a crap.
But what was it about the staff here that was different?
They're really supportive, you can talk to them, about anything, If it's something silly, they still sit there and talk to you.
In Essex and elsewhere, there's a real ambition to improve the residential home and make it work better for children in care. But the big problems for care kids may not start until they leave the system.
When I left foster home, got put in a hostel, and the first hostel I moved into was an all-girl hostel. It was mad.
As I was leaving care, didn't get no help at all.
25 girls, and not one of them normal.
Learn by either your clothes getting shrunk or your food getting burnt. So
I feel sorry for lots of kids coming out of homes because they got to live by themselves.
I've come down to Sussex to meet Jamie, who left his children's home when he was 16. After a promising start, he's now without a proper home at 19.
When I turned 16, a couple of months, they moved me into supported lodgings, and I stayed there for about a year and a half. When I got kicked out of that, that's when it came down to me staying in loads of bed and breakfasts and stuff.
And how many bed and breakfasts did you stay in once you'd moved out of your assisted lodgings?
I would have said minimum of 20 bed and breakfasts towards 30. Yeah,
it's unbelievable.
Teenagers living in bed and breakfast are not allowed to bring a can of lager back, let alone a friend. So it's not surprising they have to move on simply because they break the rules. 1 in 5 girls who leave care over 16 will become mothers within a year. Nearly a quarter of prisoners and 1 in 3 homeless people have been in care.
Do you feel you had enough training before you left care to make you able to fend for yourself, if you like, when you moved out of care?
No, not really. I didn't really get much independence training, to be honest with you. I didn't know what to do when I moved to Brighton, when I moved out of the children's home. So I was in a big city sort of type, and it was quite scary, really.
Was it?
To living on £70 a week, to having to do my own shopping, my own washing.
What shocks me the most is that children who are 16 years old and from very vulnerable backgrounds are told at the age of 16 that they're able to live on their own, and often with little or no support. And what does this say about the system of care in our country?
Some young people don't leave their families until they're 27. And boys, I think, leave even later. So I think it's really important that some of our most vulnerable young people are not forced to leave their supportive foster carers at the age of 16. That's far too young.
In Essex, they're trying to do something different by maintaining an interest in their charges even after they've left at 16.
Guitars out for later on.
The residential home run by Dave Easterbrook features a rock band made up of staff, residents and a couple of former care kids.
See you later.
See ya.
18-year-olds like Sarah and Paul come back every week and travel with the others to band practice. For that and the promise of a takeaway dinner.
Can't we dim in front? The structure. I suppose it just gives me something. Still gets me to engage with everyone that I've either lived with or I've just met along the way.
Once I come here, all the staff are fantastic.
I know that if I do have a problem, then they're there and they'll try harder to help me.
I've gone without, food a week.
So when you were in those tough moments of going without food, how did you get help?
It was mild children's home.
And they supported you?
Yeah, they supported me. I've run out of everything, and to be honest with you, they saved my life pretty much.
Well played, Paul. There is wide recognition that the whole care system needs a radical overhaul. A new project to extend the European idea of social pedagogy across 30 homes was announced last month. Last month, too, a Common Select Committee accused the state of failing in its duty to act as a parent by not adequately protecting care kids. Its chairman is Barry Shearman.
I think a lot of parents are failing their children. As a result, they end up in care, and we then fail them again by not making up to them what they've lost in their own birth family.
What should the government do more of to improve our care system?
It's got a bad name and it needs to be changed, and this is why I'm in favour of terms like social pedagogues. But it does need rebranding. It's got to be seen as a positive option, and if it's going to be a positive option, you've got to make foster caring good and reliable and secure. You've got to make the residential system fit for purpose in a modern age. It's got to be smaller with well-trained professionals, and it's got to be a system that, most of all, the children like.
It remains a lottery what kind of care kids get from the state. How much longer can we tolerate disruption to young lives that can leave so many of them disadvantaged second-class citizens? Are we prepared to spend the money and give the right priority to a system that delivers them into adult lives with the confidence and opportunities of the rest of us?
I feel that they don't see children as children, they see them as cases.
I never really understood what was going on because it was just me, one child, full with, a room full of people that I didn't know, talking about me like I wasn't there.
A lot of the time it's the little things that count to us, like just being able to give our carer a hug.
Give them Mary Poppins as a nanny. That is it. That's what I would do to improve the care system. Give them all Mary Poppins. She's brilliant.
If you've been affected by any of the issues raised in tonight's dispatches, visit our website at channel4.com/dispatches.